Hi everyone, this is Pian from AstroDinaryImaging.com. So last night I held an astrophotography workshop at the Pinnacles in Western Australia. That's about 2.5 hours north of Perth. And it's a beautiful location full of these limestone pinnacles that are hundreds of millions of years old. And the special thing about that place to me is the absolute lack of any light pollution, with the nearest town being Cervantes, which is about 20 kilometers up the road, and contains no more than 1,000 people in its total population. So it's a very small town, and there's no other major towns in that area. So you get very minimal light pollution, very beautiful skies. So anyway, I'm gonna have a look at this group shot that we took at the end of the night, and we're gonna edit this really flat looking image into something that's with high contrast, high vibrance, and makes it pop out of the screen. So we're gonna change it to something like this. Okay. So what we're trying to do here is up the vibrancy, up the contrast, and give the image a nice pop to it. This can be a bit difficult, especially when there's very bright parts of the image with an image with very high dynamic range, so we call it. So the bright whites and the dark shadows. Alright, so I'll just reset this and I'll show you how I would go about editing this image to my personal taste. Okay. First up, I'll scroll down to the bottom of the develop module, and I like to change my camera calibration profile to camera neutral. I just feel that it gives the flattest looking image and the best point to start on. Okay. So next up, I will do some lens corrections, and so I'll just turn on the remove chromatic aberration checkbox, and the next one is the lens correction profile. So this would eliminate any distortion and correct any vignetting in that the lens has. However, I do like a lot of vignetting to my images, so I tend to just turn the vignetting slider all the way back down to 0. So I'll just let you have a look of a before and after of this effect. So this is with no lens correction, and this is with lens correction. This is a very small and subtle effect, but it sort of makes the image a bit flatter. If you have if there's a horizon in the image, it makes it slightly flatter and looks more natural to the eye. Alright, next I'll go all the way up to the basic develop module here, and I want to talk about the white balance. So although you can't see the colors of the stars with your naked eye, each star has a different color, and each star has a different color. And you can edit your image based on what the colors of the stars are. But then again, this is photography, this is art. You can edit it any way you want. It's all up to your taste. It's all up to what the viewer likes to see. So in my case, I do like to have a slightly warmer image. I like to have some magentas in there. But it must be noted that the core of the Milky Way contains no magenta light. Scientifically, there is no chemical balance in there that would emit magenta hue light. So don't go overboard with the magenta slider, and yeah, just try to keep it as neutral looking as possible. So in this case, I've sort of found that the best balance for my camera is about 4200 and plus 20 tint. And you can see it's slightly warmer now. Get a bit of magenta coming into the sky as well. And this is a nice starting base to work with. So we'll start with this. Next up, we'll go to the white slider. If you press the Alt key and you slide the white slider up, it shows you where the white points are clipping. So in this case, the middle of the frame where we have the big speed light, that's going to be bright white. That's going to be, it would have clipped the dynamic range. So that's okay to be bright white, and maybe we have a few of the largest stars that are white as well. Everything else should contain some color. Next up, we go to the black slider, I tend to press Alt again, and you can see any part that shows up in this mask is pure black. And we don't want to have any pure black in this case. We're going to slide it up by a little bit. Alright, so next up, the clarity slider. This is quite a misused slider, where people seem to slide it too much to the right and sort of break their images. So what this does, it adds micro contrast between pixels. So for between, let's say, one pixel is dark, one pixel is light, it will add more contrast to that section of pixels. So in this case, say if you turn it all the way to 100, it sort of pops out, but you break the image quite badly. If we zoom in, we're going to see what stars on his head and all these artifacts that come up. You really break the image. It looks pretty bad. So I tend to never slide it more than plus 15. If you go anywhere like 30, I feel that's going a bit too far already. But then again, this is a personal taste. So I put it back to plus 15. And next up, I like a lot of vibrancy in my images. I tend to add about plus 30. And at the same time, I reduce the saturation to compensate for the high vibrance. And so this is starting to look pretty balanced to me now. Next up, we want to play around with the contrast. I really love high contrast images, and just using the contrast slider alone is not really going to get you anywhere. That doesn't give you enough control. So what we do in that, instead of using the contrast slider, we'll use the tone curve instead, and we'll edit the contrast manually. Okay, so first up, I tend to take my black point and I'll raise it a little bit. This sort of gives everything a very mild, washed out look, and makes it almost look like a print, like a film print. And some people say that this sort of looks like an Instagram filter, but hey, I reckon it looks pretty good. So next up, I'm going to put an anchor point in the shadows, and I'm going to bring that all the way down, and that looks about right there. And then I'm going to anchor another point up here in the highlights and boost it. And that looks about right there. Okay. So top of the image now is starting to look a bit too bright. The speed light here is getting too bright. I'm going to turn down the highlights a little bit. Raise up the whites so it pops a bit more. And I'm going to raise up the shadows a little bit to say some detail in the people. Okay. Alright. Okay, that looks about right. Okay, so the sky looks nice to me already. But what we want to do is add a graduated filter to the sky. This would give it a bit more contrast and balance out the image a little bit more. So just drag from the top down to about halfway. Yep. And then we're going to add some contrast to that, maybe about plus 25 or so. Play around with the highlight slider. We'll turn it down, but we'll turn the whites up. A bit more pop and sharpness there. And very tiny amount of clarity added there. So this just brings out a nice pop in the sky. Okay, so the bottom part of the image is looking a bit too yellow to me right now. So I'm going to individually turn down some colors that feel too saturated to me. So if I turn down the vibrance all the way back to 0 and turn the saturation back to 0, the foreground doesn't look as bad. But if I'm going to turn it back up to plus 30 and minus 10 for the saturation, it looks a bit too saturated in the foreground. So what we use is the HSL sliders, hue, saturation, and luminance. I'm going to change the hue of the yellow and the orange colors in this image. I'm going to put a little bit more red into them. So I'm going to slide the yellow slider down to minus 30. Same thing for the orange slider, down a little bit. Okay, alright, so now the color of the foreground looks okay, but it's still too saturated. So what we do, just go to the saturation tab instead, and we'll turn down the yellow and the orange. There we go. So just to have, just so you can see like a before and after. That's without any HSL sliders, and that's with them on. And if it's looking a bit too dull in the foreground now, because we have changed the colors of the foreground, we add some luminance values back into those colors that we've taken out. So you see the foreground starting to pop a little bit more now as well. Okay, so that's nearly done. I just want to add a little bit more vignetting to emphasize the middle of the image here. So what I would do is put on some vignetting with the feather all the way up to 100, and we'll slowly pull the midpoint into the image. That's about, looks alright. And roundness, we'll keep it about there. And then we can turn, we can add more vignetting. There we go. Okay. So this image is starting to look pretty balanced to me, and I like the look of it. I like the faded blacks. It makes it look like a film image. So the last thing that we want to do is some technical cleanups. So we're going to do noise reductions and sharpening. So we can look closely at this pinnacle. We can see some grain that's visible, and like, to be honest, you're going to get grain in every Astro image, just because that you're dealing with high ISOs, in this case ISO 3200. So you got to accept that there's going to be grain and noise in your image, but we can correct it to a certain extent before we start smudging up everything. Okay, so I tend to never add more than plus 30 noise reduction for a single frame. So what I do is zoom in on a high contrast section of the image, something with some shadows and some brights, and this is with no noise reduction at all. I'll slowly slide it up, and you can see how this section of the image becomes much cleaner. And the next thing we're going to do is the color noise balance, so color noise reduction. I'm going to add that about plus 40 at maximum. We don't want to go overboard with that, and the smoothness, about plus 60 or so. And these are personal settings that I found works for my images. It's best to experiment with the sliders yourself. And finally, the last part I like to do is add about 50% of sharpening. And if you press the Alt key and slide the masking slider up, any of the white points on the image will be sharpened, and any of the black points will not be sharpened at all. So it'll be left out. So in this case, we want to sharpen the stars, make it each star, make it as pinpoint as possible, and the outlines of the people in the image, we'll let the software sharpen that as well. It's a very subtle difference that you probably couldn't see unless you're looking at one-to-one. But in this case, I would consider this image done. So all you need to do next is export it. In this case, I'm just going to put it onto the desktop. Put a JPEG file format. And if you're going to print it, use the Pro Photo or Adobe RGB color space. If you're going to post it online, use sRGB. Except you're going to resize it to whatever size you want to do it. In this case, we're going to do 2560 pixels across, and with the resolution of 72 pixels per inch. So we want to use 72 pixels per inch if you're posting it online, and you want to use 300 pixels per inch if you are printing it. And then we put a mild sharpening for it as well. Screen sharpening with a very low percentage. And last but not least, you might want to put on your logo, your watermark. So in this case, that's all done, and this is what the final image looks like. Alright, so if you have any questions, just feel free to leave it in comments or message me directly. I'm happy to help at any time, happy to answer your questions. And yep, till next time. This is Pian from AstroDinaryImaging.com signing out.